Hello and welcome. Welcome back, or welcome for the very first time. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're in your bedroom, blankets pulled up, the house completely still. Maybe you're in a small apartment in a big city, the distant hum of traffic drifting in. Maybe you're somewhere far away, a country I've never visited, a city I'd love to hear the name of. Wherever you are, you belong here. This voice will find you. Tonight we're going to follow one story through one of the most beautiful and most haunting worlds in all of video game history, the world of Bloodborne. And the story belongs to one person, one of the most quietly tragic characters ever put to screen. Her name is Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower. If you've played Bloodborne, you know her already. That red coat, those long pale hands, the way she fights, not with brutality but with something that looks almost like grief, as if every strike is an apology she can't stop making, as if she has been waiting in that tower for someone to finally come and end something she couldn't end herself. And if you've never played, if you're here simply because you needed something long and immersive and slow tonight, you don't need any prior knowledge. I'll build the whole world for you from the ground up, carefully, unhurried, like laying stones one at a time across still water. So settle in, find the position that feels right, let your jaw unclench and your shoulders drop, and the surface beneath you take your full weight. We begin not with Maria, but with the world that made her, because to understand her, we first have to understand what she was standing on, and what was moving in the dark beneath it. Long before Gehrman, long before the hunt, long before any of the names we'll speak tonight had meaning, there was something else entirely. There were the Pthumerians. Imagine a civilization so ancient that it doesn't exist in any history book. A people who built not upward toward the sky, but downward, into the earth, into caverns and labyrinths so deep that sunlight became a distant memory. They carved great chalice dungeons from the stone, vast cathedral-like halls supported by columns thicker than houses, adorned with carvings that told stories in a language no one alive can read anymore. These were a people of tremendous sophistication. They understood architecture, ritual, metallurgy, medicine, and most importantly, they understood something that no other civilization of their era had grasped: the power of blood. The Pthumerians were the keepers of something extraordinary. Deep beneath their civilization, deeper than their deepest dungeon, in a place the game calls the Pthumerian Labyrinth, there was something sleeping, something vast and old and impossible, an entity that didn't belong to the world as we understand it, not to the earth, not to the sky, not to any of the four directions. Something that existed in a dimension of consciousness and cosmic intelligence that human minds could only partially, painfully perceive. These beings were called the Great Ones. We'll return to the Great Ones many times tonight. They're woven through every part of this story, the way cold is woven through winter air. You don't see it, but you feel it in everything you touch. For now, all you need to understand is this: the Great Ones were unfathomably ancient, unfathomably strange, and their blood was unlike anything else in existence. The Pthumerians discovered this blood. They found that it could heal, it could strengthen, it could enhance the mind, sharpen perception, grant visions and insights that ordinary consciousness couldn't access. And like every civilization that has ever discovered something powerful and intoxicating, they built their entire culture around it. They became the stewards of the Great Ones. They guarded these sleeping entities in the depth of their labyrinths. They performed rituals to keep them calm, to honour them, to draw power from them in measured, careful ways. The Pthumerians were not reckless. They understood, at least at first, that what they were handling was dangerous. You don't keep a sleeping god beneath your city without developing a profound respect for what happens if it wakes up angry. But here's the thing about blood. Here's the thing about power. Here's the thing about any substance that makes you feel transcendent, limitless, extraordinary. It doesn't stay controlled forever. The dose that healed yesterday requires a larger dose to heal today. The vision that was sharp and clear last year has started to blur at the edges. You need more. You need closer contact. You need deeper communion. The Pthumerians over centuries began to lose their grip. They were not corrupted all at once. That's important to understand. The tragedy of Pthumeru is a slow tragedy, a gentle slope that, by the time you realise you're descending, is far too steep to climb back. They began with careful, respectful contact with the Great Ones and their blood. They ended with frenzied worship, with physical transformation, with their own biology being remade by prolonged exposure to something their bodies were never designed to contain. The deeper dungeons in Bloodborne show you what they became. Not human anymore, exactly. Not monsters, exactly. Something in between. Elongated, pale, strong, with eyes that have seen too much, and minds that have been stretched past what human consciousness can sustain. Some of them became the watchers and wardens you fight in the dungeons. Some became the great matriarchs and patriarchs preserved in coffins and ceremonial chambers. Some became amygdalae, those long-limbed, many-eyed creatures that cling to the buildings of Gehrman like grotesque gargoyles, visible only to those whose own perception has been sufficiently expanded by the old blood. The Pthumerian civilization eventually collapsed. Exactly how and why is unclear. The game preserves this mystery carefully, giving you fragments and implications rather than a complete narrative. But the shape of the collapse is legible. Too much blood, too much communion, too much contact with something that was never meant to be touched by minds as small and fragile as human ones. The labyrinths remained, sealed, silent, waiting, and the blood remained too. For a long time the world above had no knowledge of any of this. The labyrinths were deep, the seals were effective. Centuries passed, perhaps millennia. The surface world developed in its own direction. Towns, cities, feudal structures, religion, war, trade, all the ordinary machinery of human civilization grinding along in complete ignorance of what lay beneath. Then someone found a crack. The city of Gehrman grew up near one of the old Pthumerian sites. This wasn't an accident. There's a suggestion throughout the lore that the Great Ones have a way of drawing people toward them, of making certain places feel significant, chosen, worth building upon. Whether or not that's true, Gehrman grew, and at some point someone dug deep enough to find the echoes of Pthumeru, found traces of the old healing blood, found enough to understand that what they'd discovered was extraordinary, that someone, or those someones, eventually made contact with an entity called Laurence. Laurence is a crucial figure in Bloodborne's backstory. He was a scholar, brilliant, ambitious, visionary in the way that men of his era could be, which is to say his vision was vast and largely unchecked by humility. He formed a group of like-minded scholars called the Healing Church, and together with a man whose name you might recognise, a man named Gehrman, he set about transforming what the Pthumerians had discovered into something new, something systematised, something that could be shared. Laurence believed, genuinely, passionately believed, that the old blood could change the world, that it could heal diseases that had no cure, that it could lift humanity above its current limitations, that the Great Ones, these cosmic intelligences, were not threats but teachers, and that communion with them was not madness but enlightenment. He was a man of tremendous conviction and tremendous charisma, the kind of person who makes other brilliant people believe that the impossible is simply the not yet attempted. He gathered those brilliant people around him. He gave them purpose and resources and the particular galvanizing energy of someone who has located the center of a great project and is willing to organize his entire life around it. The Healing Church became, under his leadership, something real and powerful and institutionally formidable. It built cathedrals, it trained healers, it developed the sacrament of blood ministration, where the sick and injured came to receive transfusions of the old blood and were healed, sometimes miraculously. Gehrman became famous for this. People travelled from distant lands to receive treatment that no ordinary physician could provide. He was wrong about the cost. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Healing Church established itself in Gehrman. They built cathedrals, they trained healers, they developed a sacrament, a ritual of blood ministration, where the sick and injured came to receive transfusions of the old blood and were healed, sometimes miraculously. Gehrman became famous for this. Word spread. People travelled from distant lands to receive treatment that no ordinary physician could provide. For a while, it worked. For a while, the dream Laurence had dreamed seemed to be coming true. The church grew. Gehrman grew with it. The healing sacrament spread. The labyrinths below were being systematically explored, the knowledge accumulated, everything pointed forward and upward and outward, toward the vast cosmic intelligence that Laurence had glimpsed and was still reaching for. But Pthumeru's lesson was there for anyone willing to read it. The blood gave with one hand and took with the other. Recipients healed, yes, but they also changed. And in Gehrman, as in the ancient labyrinths below, change had a way of accelerating once it began. Now, I want you to feel the weight of all of this settling around you, all this history, all this accumulated consequence. Let it be like bedding heaped upon you, each layer a little heavier than the last in the most comfortable way. You don't need to remember every name, every detail. Just let the shape of it settle into you, an ancient world, a powerful discovery, the best of intentions, the slow, inevitable slide. Because out of all of this, out of Pthumeru's fall, out of Laurence's dream, out of the Healing Church's carefully constructed system of power and belief, out of all of it, a figure is about to emerge who will matter more to us than any of them. A woman, a hunter, a noble, a student, a soldier, a person who made choices she could not take back, and who spent the rest of her existence paying a price that never fully balanced the debt. Her name is Maria, but she isn't born yet. Not quite. We have one more piece of this world to understand first. Let your breathing slow a little more. The room is quiet. The world outside is distant and unimportant. There's nothing required of you. Just follow the sound of the voice and let the story carry you forward, gently, like a current in still water. There is a place in Bloodborne that feels different from everywhere else in the game. Every area in Bloodborne is dark and oppressive and strange, but most of them are oppressive in a recognizable way. Gothic architecture, plague and disease, religious fervour gone wrong, the corruption of urban spaces. The Fishing Hamlet is oppressive in a completely different register. It feels like the end of the world, not the end of the world in the dramatic sense, not fire and collapse and grand catastrophe. The end of the world in the quiet sense, in the sense of this is where the known world stops. This is the edge. Beyond this there is only ocean, and beyond the ocean there is something that cannot be named. The Fishing Hamlet is a small coastal settlement, or was once. The kind of place you'd expect to find in a Victorian-era seaside region. Low wooden buildings, fishing boats rotting at a dock, barrels of salt fish, rope and nets strung everywhere. The people who lived here were working people. They caught fish, they mended nets, they lived close to the water and understood its moods. Their lives were governed by tides and seasons and the eternal, indifferent patience of the sea. And then something came out of the sea, or rather, something in the sea was found. Exactly how this discovery happened is left deliberately vague in the lore. The Fishing Hamlet's residents, these simple, unassuming fishing people, stumbled upon something extraordinary in the waters they had fished for generations. Something that has been sleeping in the deep water, undisturbed, for perhaps as long as the Pthumerian civilization had been sleeping in the earth. A great one. This great one is connected to the ocean, to the cosmos, to something called the arcane, the ancient knowledge that precedes blood as a source of power. The villagers found evidence of this entity, perhaps physical traces, a body or remains or artifacts, or something that partook of both flesh and starlight in equal measure. They found something that was clearly not of their world, clearly vast in its significance, clearly connected to forces that dwarfed anything they could comprehend. And because they were human, and because humans are fundamentally curious and fundamentally faithful, they did what humans do with things they find sacred and incomprehensible. They built a small shrine, they offered worship, they incorporated this discovery into their lives and their rituals, quietly, without making great proclamations to the outside world. This was their secret, their sacred thing. They didn't use the blood, they didn't form a church, they didn't systematize their contact into doctrine and hierarchy. They simply kept it, honored it, maintained a relationship with the incomprehensible thing in the water, with a kind of humble, uncomplicated reverence that the healing church, for all its sophistication, had lost the ability to feel. Now, here is where the Fishing Hamlet story and the main lore of Gehrman intersect in a way that is devastating. The healing church, in their ongoing project of expanding their knowledge of the Great Ones and of the cosmos, became aware of what the villagers had found. Exactly how is not spelled out, but we can imagine the mechanisms. The church had resources, scholars, spies, the kind of institutional apparatus that reaches into every corner of a region eventually. Someone heard something. Someone followed a thread. Someone sent word back to the church that out in a small hamlet by the sea there was something remarkable, and the church sent researchers. Chief among them eventually was a man named Brador. Brador is one of the most haunting peripheral figures in the DLC's lore, a church hunter who was present at the Fishing Hamlet, who participated in what happened there and who afterward requested to be imprisoned. He asked to be locked away. He sent his own jailer's key, a key to a cell deep in the nightmare, ahead of himself, and then he surrendered to confinement. Brador, who killed other hunters who came close to the nightmare's secrets, who wore the skin of a beast on his head as a form of penance or self-punishment or identification with what he'd helped destroy, is one of the most legible expressions of guilt in the entire game. He and Maria are mirrors of each other in this, both present for the massacre, both subsequently unable to function normally in the world, both choosing a form of confinement. Brador the literal cell, Maria the Clocktower, as their response. The difference is that Brador turned his guilt outward as violence against other hunters who came too close, while Maria turned hers into guardianship. Brador locks people out. Maria stands between what needs protecting and those who would harm it. Same root, different flower. And among the hunters who accompanied these researchers, among the men and women whose job it was to protect the scholars and ensure the expedition could continue safely, were some of the finest hunters the church had, including, at some point, Lady Maria herself. But I'm getting slightly ahead. Let me slow down here, because the Fishing Hamlet matters so much to what Lady Maria becomes. It is not simply a place she visited, it is the place where she changed irreversibly. It is the place around which her entire interior life subsequently organised itself. Every choice she made after the Fishing Hamlet was made in relationship to what happened there. So let's understand what the villagers had. What made this discovery so significant to the healing church, and so dangerous? The Great One associated with the Fishing Hamlet is related to what the game calls arcane knowledge, the oldest kind of wisdom, older than the old blood, older than the healing churches and the Pthumerian dungeons. If blood represents one path to understanding the cosmos, biological, embodied, transmitted through veins and arteries, then the arcane represents something older and colder, starlight rather than blood. The knowledge written in void spaces between celestial bodies rather than in living tissue. The villagers had physical contact with something partaking of this arcane nature, and this prolonged contact had begun to change them, not in the catastrophic way that blood exposure changed Yarnamites, but in stranger ways. Their bodies incorporated elements of the deep sea and the cosmos. Their biology drifted. Some developed characteristics that the outside world would have called monstrous, but which in the context of the hamlet were simply marks of proximity to the sacred. They became gradually something not quite human, not quite fish, not quite the creatures of the deep either, something new, something in between. And they were, by all available evidence, peaceful. They maintained their hamlet. They maintained their rituals. They maintained their relationship with the thing in the water, with the patient, careful devotion of people who understood, better than most, that what they were in the presence of was something that deserved respect rather than exploitation. The healing church saw something different when they looked at them. They saw knowledge. They saw subjects. They saw a resource. This is the shape of the horror that is coming. I want you to rest in the hamlet for a moment, in your imagination. Picture it in the last moment before everything changes. Small wooden houses, the sound of water on stone, a few boats bobbing gently at a dock in the grey light. A community of people, strange in appearance perhaps, altered by their long proximity to the deep, but living, breathing, maintaining their quiet traditions, not harming anyone, carrying their sacred secret with the dignity of people who understand that not everything needs to be shared with the wider world. There is peace here, fragile perhaps, but real. Let that image settle. Let it be present in your mind as we continue, because you're going to want to remember it. You're going to want to hold on to this image of the hamlet before that exists only in implication and inference in the game itself, but that you can feel the ghost of in every corner of its ruined present. Now let's talk about who Lady Maria was before she arrived in the hamlet. Let's go back a little further and understand the woman who would one day stand on this shore. The name Maria tells us something right away. In the world of Bloodborne, where nearly every significant character is given a title or a descriptor that tells you something about their role or nature, the good hunter, the doll, the moon presence, Maria carries a name that is both simple and loaded. Maria, one of the most ancient names in Western European culture, carrying associations of purity, suffering, witness to tragedy, and a kind of sacred grief. The Mary who stands at the foot of the cross and watches something beloved be destroyed without being able to stop it. The Mary who endures, who remembers, who becomes defined by what she witnessed. Whether this is intentional on the part of Bloodborne's creators, almost certainly it is, because nothing in this game is accidental. It establishes from the very beginning a certain emotional register for this character. She is not a hero in the triumphant sense. She is a witness. She is someone who will carry what she has seen long after the event itself has ended. But she didn't begin as a witness. She began as something much simpler, and in some ways much harder. Lady Maria was a Cainhurst noble. Cainhurst is one of the most intriguing factions in Bloodborne's world. The vile bloods of Cainhurst Castle occupy a position in Yharnam's political and theological landscape that is simultaneously elevated and despised. They were a noble house with deep roots, with an aristocratic tradition of blood lineage that predated the Healing Church's organised religion. Their blood, Cainhurst blood, vile blood, was considered heretical by the Church, a corrupt and sinful variety of the old blood that produced a different kind of transformation than the Church-sanctioned variety. The politics of this are complicated, and we don't need to dwell in them too deeply tonight. What matters for our purposes is this. Cainhurst was a place of pride and refinement and extreme capability. Its nobles were trained from youth in the arts of war, in horseback riding, in the blade. They were tall, pale people. You can see this in Lady Maria's design, in her extraordinary height, in the aristocratic angles of her face, in the way she moves with the kind of unconscious grace that comes from a lifetime of physical training. She was, by all indication, exceptional, even among Cainhursts exceptional. There's something in her bearing, in the way the game presents her, in the scraps of dialogue and item descriptions that reference her, that suggests a woman of tremendous natural talent and tremendous natural pride. Not arrogance, exactly. Pride. There's a difference. Arrogance is a closed door. Pride is a closed door you've earned the right to close. At some point, and the exact circumstances are not narrated to us, Lady Maria left Cainhurst, or was sent from it, or chose to leave it. The game doesn't specify, and I find this deliberate vagueness beautiful. It means her origin story belongs in some sense to us. We can imagine her reasons. We can imagine a young woman of 17 or 20 or 25 carrying everything Cainhurst gave her, the training, the bearing, the blade, and walking towards something new. What was new was Gehrman the First Hunter. Let that title settle for a moment. Not a first hunter, not one of the first hunter, the original, the template, the man who, in partnership with Laurence of the Healing Church, developed the concept and practice of the hunt as a systematic response to the beast plague that was increasingly threatening Yharnam's population. Gehrman was, by every indication available to us, extraordinary. He was the one who understood that the solution to the beast problem had to be human, that you couldn't fight transformed, maddened, powerful creatures with ordinary soldiers or ordinary police. You needed hunters. People trained specifically for this work, equipped with specialized weapons, capable of operating in the conditions the hunt demanded. darkness, chaos, the particular horror of facing someone who was recently human and is human no longer. He was also evidently a remarkable teacher, because Lady Maria became his student, his apprentice, perhaps his closest student, not necessarily in the sense of favourites, though she may have been that too, but closest in the sense of alignment. The student who most thoroughly internalised not just the techniques but the philosophy. The student whose understanding of what a hunter was and what a hunter was for most closely matched Gehrman's own. They trained together. We can imagine the sessions. Long days in a courtyard that would later become the hunter's dream. Weapons drawn in slow ceremonial arcs before the arcs became lightning fast and sure. Gehrman teaching not just movement but reading. How to read a beast. How to read the environment. How to read yourself in the moment of crisis. Maria learning with that particular quality of attention that the truly talented have. Total, focused, alive to every correction and every nuance. We can imagine the evenings too, the workshop in whatever space preceded the dream, the smell of oil and metal, the sound of a blade being drawn carefully along a whetstone, the specific quality of silence between two people who understand each other well enough not to fill it with words. Gehrman would have been older than her, considerably so, and the dynamic between a master and a gifted student who gradually becomes a colleague and then perhaps an equal has its own particular texture. The way the teacher's tone shifts imperceptibly over time, the way the questions change from instructional to genuine, the way "what do you think" replaces "here is what I know." Maria would have navigated this transition with the precision she brought to everything else, not pushing toward it, not performing readiness, simply being ready when it came, in the way that the genuinely capable are ready, without fanfare, without announcement. The other hunters of the workshop would have known her too, seen her, understood over time that she was exceptional in a way that even the generally exceptional struggled to match. Not because she was more aggressive or more willing to take risks. If anything, she may have been more disciplined than most, the Cainhurst training visible in every movement's economy, but because she was more present, more consistently, quietly, completely there. The quality of someone whose mind does not wander during the work. The quality of someone who has decided in the fullest possible sense that this is what they are. The rakuyo, Maria's signature weapon, that elegant, precise twin blade, was fashioned in homage to Gehrman's own weapon, the burial blade. Not a copy, an homage, a student's tribute, a way of saying, I learned from you, I carry what you taught me. Every time I use this weapon, it is conversation between your way and mine. There's something in this that is quietly heartbreaking when you know the rest of the story. Because Gehrman loved Maria, not necessarily romantically, though there is certainly a reading of the lore that suggests his feelings were complex and deeply personal, but with a profound, particular love that a teacher can feel for a student who surpasses their expectations. A student who makes the teacher feel that their work was worthwhile. A student who carries something forward. And Maria, by all indication, loved Gehrman too, trusted him, followed him. This woman who had left or been sent from Cainhurst with all its pride and distance, she opened something in herself under Gehrman's teaching. She became a hunter not as performance or profession but as identity. She was not someone who hunted. She was a hunter, the way some people are musicians or healers. It wasn't what she did, it was what she was. This is what makes what comes next so devastating. Because the hunt was not merely a philosophical exercise or a practical profession, it was Gehrman's vision, and Gehrman's vision was built on a foundation that Gehrman himself may not have fully understood. or that he understood too well and chose not to examine too closely. Because the hunt was connected to Laurence. Laurence was connected to the Healing Church. The Healing Church was connected to the Great Ones. And the Great Ones, as the Pthumerians had discovered long before, had a way of making everything they touched more complicated and more costly than it initially appeared. Lady Maria was a hunter in service to this larger structure. She didn't set the agenda, she executed it. She was the blade, Gehrman was the hand. Laurence and the church were the mind behind the hand. For a while, perhaps for years, this arrangement worked, and Maria was simply what she was: exceptional, principled, effective, a hunter in the truest sense. And then she went to the fishing hamlet. Let's take a breath before we continue. Feel yourself sinking a little deeper into wherever you are. The story is going to get heavier for a while. Not unbearably heavy, not the kind of heavy that keeps you awake, but the kind that settles into you the way sorrow settles, gently and thoroughly. Trust it. It's a story worth following to the end. The fire is low. The room is quiet. You are safe. Let me tell you what happened in the fishing hamlet. Let me tell you as clearly as I can, because it is the centre of everything, the event around which Lady Maria's entire existence subsequently orbited. The stone dropped into still water, whose ripples reached every other moment of her life. The Healing Church sent an expedition to the fishing hamlet. Their purpose was research. Specifically, they wanted to access the knowledge the villagers had accumulated through their proximity to the Great One in the water. They wanted what the villagers knew, what the villagers were, what the villagers carried in their changed bodies and their long memories. The villagers were not willing to simply hand this over. This is not surprising. This was their sacred thing, their secret, the source of their community's identity and their spiritual life. The body or remains or presence of the entity in the water was not property to be claimed by an outside institution. It was theirs, in the deepest sense that a community can claim a thing. The church's researchers, the scholars who had come to extract this knowledge, were not deterred by the villagers' reluctance. They had, after all, an authority that extended well beyond this coastal settlement. They had the backing of Yharnam's most powerful institution. They had hunters. What happened next is not stated explicitly in the game's text. It is implied. It is implicit in the ruined state of the hamlet as you find it. It is implicit in the nature of the enemies you encounter there. The villagers, transformed by grief and rage and the strange power they carried into something barely recognizable as the gentle coastal people they once were. It is implicit in the fishing hamlet's desolation, in the absence of any working community, any living tradition, any continuity. The hunters massacred the people of the fishing hamlet. They killed them. Not all in one moment, perhaps. Not a single military engagement, but a process, an escalation. Perhaps it began with resistance and became suppression. Perhaps it began with suppression and became something worse. Perhaps orders were given that were more explicit than suppress resistance. Perhaps the scholars needed access to things the living villagers would never willingly provide. Whatever the precise sequence of events, the end result is clear. The fishing hamlet was destroyed. Its population was killed or driven to the edges of madness and monstrosity by trauma and loss. A peaceful community, strange, yes, changed by their long exposure to the arcane entity in their waters, but peaceful, coherent, human in the ways that matter, was annihilated. And Lady Maria was there. This is what breaks her. Not the fact of death, She was a hunter. She had killed. She understood violence and its necessity in the context she'd been given. Not even the scale of it, perhaps. What breaks her is what it means, what it reveals about the structure she'd been serving, what it reveals about the difference between what she thought she was doing and what she was actually part of. She thought she was a hunter. She thought hunters served a purpose, protecting the innocent, holding back the tide of the beast plague, preserving human life against the terrible transformations that the old blood could induce. She had dedicated herself to this with the totality that only the genuinely principled can manage. She was not someone who did things halfway. She was not someone who maintained comfortable ambiguity about her own values. And then she was present for the murder of an innocent people, not beasts, not transformed victims of the plague. People, fishermen and their families, builders of small shrines, keepers of quiet traditions, people whose only crime was to live near something that a powerful institution decided it wanted. There's an item in the game called the underground cell inner chamber key. There's evidence in the hamlet's layout and its hidden areas that suggests that after the massacre, the villagers who survived were imprisoned. Their bodies used for the church's ongoing research into the arcane properties of their transformed biology, kept alive in cells beneath the hamlet, studied, their existence perpetuated in the most degraded and dehumanizing way possible. Because dead they were merely specimens, but alive they were something more useful. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means to be kept alive for that purpose. To have survived the killing only to be preserved as a living resource. To have your transformation, the mark of your community's long sacred relationship with the entity in the water, the physical sign of your proximity to the cosmic, become the thing that makes you valuable to the people who destroyed your home. The thing they wanted was written in your body. They couldn't get it any other way. So they kept you in the dark in a cell, and they took what they needed. Whether Maria participated in this specifically, whether she was present for the imprisonment as well as the killing, is uncertain. What is certain is that she knew, she learned. At some point, the full scope of what had happened and what was continuing to happen became clear to her, and that knowing was the thing that broke whatever had held her in the structure she'd been serving. Here's an item description from Bloodborne that I want to read to you slowly. It's from the Rachio, Maria's weapon. It says, "A trick weapon crafted by the workshop of the hunter's dream. This weapon, a relic of Lady Maria, was later employed by the first hunter Gehrman. The dual wield of the extended and folded forms, one offensive and one defensive, is a style of fighting deeply tied to the teachings of the church hunters, crafted by the workshop, employed by Gehrman. This weapon that is the signature of Lady Maria's fighting style, this precise, elegant, deeply personal weapon, is also entangled with the church. It was always entangled with the church. From the very beginning, her identity as a hunter was inseparable from the institutional structure that would commit the Fishing Hamlet massacre. There's no clean division. There's no, I was a good hunter before the bad things happened. The bad things were baked into the structure from the start. The Healing Church's project of knowledge extraction and power accumulation was always going to arrive at the Fishing Hamlet eventually. The question was just when. And Maria, for all her principles, had been a part of that structure, had given it her best self, had donated her talent and her integrity to something that was using those qualities in service of ends she hadn't examined closely enough. This is not a comfortable realization for anyone to have. It is especially uncomfortable for someone as principled and self-demanding as Maria clearly was. For someone who had built her identity so thoroughly around being a hunter, around being the particular kind of person that a hunter in Gehrman's vision was supposed to be, the discovery that this identity had been used, that it had been a vehicle for something monstrous, is not just guilt. It is a kind of annihilation of the self. Who is she if what she was is contaminated? Who is she if the thing she gave her life to, the thing that gave her life meaning, was always secretly in service of this? She does not have a good answer to this question. She may not have even been sure how to ask it properly. What she does is withdraw, not run away. Lady Maria was not the kind of person who ran from things, but she withdrew from the active life of the church's hunters. She went to the clock tower. The Astral Clocktower at the top of the research hall, that strange isolated architectural space in the sky, connected to the Academy of Bürgenwerth and the church's ongoing research projects, but also fundamentally separate from them, a place apart. She took the key to the Fishing Hamlet's underground cells and she threw it into the well in the research hall. Think about that. Think about what that action means. She didn't destroy the key. She may not have been able to destroy it, or she may have believed that destroying it would cause more harm than sealing it away. But she didn't keep it either. She didn't go back. She didn't try to undo what had been done. She knew better than to think that was possible. She put it somewhere no one could easily reach it, and she turned away from it. This is not the action of someone who has made peace with what happened. This is the action of someone who has acknowledged the wound and decided that the best she can do is keep it from bleeding any further. It is not enough. It will never be enough. She knows this. Before we continue, I want to take a moment here, in the middle of this story. We've travelled a long way together already, from the ancient depths of Pthumeru to the shores of the Fishing Hamlet, from the first discovery of the old blood to the worst thing Lady Maria ever did. We're at the midpoint now, the centre of the story, the pivot around which everything else turns. And if this journey has been meaningful to you tonight, if the voice has been a comfort, if the story has carried you somewhere quieter and slower and more peaceful, then I gently invite you to share it. Tell someone about it. A friend who also lies awake too long at night. A fellow Bloodborne fan who might love to hear their favourite world unfolded this slowly and this thoroughly. A stranger on the internet who's searching for something exactly like this. Wherever you found this, a podcast, a YouTube channel, a recommendation from someone you trust, a like, a follow, a comment saying where you're listening from means more than you might think. It's what allows this work to continue. It's what makes more nights like this one possible. And if you're just here to sleep, that is completely perfect. You don't owe anything. Just let yourself go. Now, back to Maria. She's in the clock tower now. Let me describe this place to you, because it's one of the most quietly extraordinary spaces in the game. The Astral Clocktower is not connected to the regular geography of Gehrman in any straightforward way. Like many of the game's most significant locations, it exists in a kind of liminal space, connected to the material world through the research hall, but also adjacent to something else, something more. The clock tower seems to float at the intersection of Gehrman's physical architecture and the broader, stranger geography that the game sometimes calls the hunter's nightmare or the cosmos, that vast, dark, bewildering space that the Great Ones inhabit. It is tall, it is ornate, it is full of the particular kind of beauty that belongs to places that have been abandoned by their original purpose. and are now waiting for something they haven't been told about yet. The clock mechanisms are extraordinary. Enormous gears and escapements and pendulums operating in the upper reaches of the tower with a patient, regular rhythm that is, in the context of this story, almost unbearably poignant. A clock that keeps time perfectly in a place where the normal flow of time has been disrupted. A mechanism that maintains its precision when everything else has lost its definition. Maria is at the top of this tower. She has been there by the time the player reaches her for an unknown amount of time. Months, certainly, possibly years. The Hunter's Nightmare, where the clock tower is located when the player accesses it, is not subject to ordinary time. How long has she been there? We don't know. Long enough that the research hall below has become a horror show of failed experiments and screaming patients. Patients whose eyes were destroyed in the church's increasingly desperate attempts to force the insights that come naturally only to those with legitimate contact with the cosmos. Long enough that Gehrman, in the main game, when you mention the Fishing Hamlet, responds with a silence that tells you he knows exactly what you're referring to and has been carrying it himself. What does Lady Maria do in the clock tower during this time? She guards it. She has become the warden of the clock tower's secret. Because beneath the tower, accessed only through a locked door in a room that feels specifically like a memorial, with a music box that plays a tune connected to Gehrman and the hunter's dream. Beneath all of that is what the Fishing Hamlet survivors became, or what their presence left behind, or what the church kept there. The precise nature of what is beneath the clock tower is another of the game's beautiful mysteries. But its quality is clear. It is something sacred, something terrible, something that exists at the intersection of the harm done to the Fishing Hamlet villagers and the broader cosmic reality that the church was always trying to exploit. Maria stands between this secret and the world above. Is this penance? Almost certainly. But it's a specific kind of penance, not the kind that involves self-flagellation or public confession or the performance of humility. It's the kind of penance that involves showing up, continuing to be present, doing the only useful thing left to do, which is ensuring that the harm done cannot be compounded further by others reaching this place and doing something even worse with what they find. She has become her own imprisonment. She doesn't have to be in the clock tower. Whatever chains keep her there are entirely of her own making. She has chosen this, because she can't undo what happened, but she can stand here. She can make sure that this particular site of horror doesn't become a resource for further horror. She can be the lock on a door that never should have been opened. This is an extraordinarily lonely way to live. Think about what her days must be like. Think about what it means to be Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower. She was trained for action, for movement, for the night hunt in fog and dark. She was built for crisis, for quick decisions, for the physical and emotional demands of hunting in Yharnam's streets. She is one of the most capable individuals her world has produced, and she stands day after day in a tower that keeps perfect time in a place where time has lost its meaning, guarding a secret she cannot share with anyone, carrying a guilt she cannot put down. There is something almost monastic about this life she has chosen. The monastic tradition in various religious cultures throughout human history understood that certain kinds of spiritual work require stillness, isolation, the deliberate narrowing of one's world to a single purpose. The monk in the cell, the hermit on the mountain, the person who has taken themselves out of ordinary life and dedicated what remains to a single act of sustained attention. Maria's vigil has this quality. It is not comfortable, and it is not peaceful, and it is not the cheerful self-giving of a vocation happily chosen, but it is committed, it is specific, it is a life organised around a single irreducible task, and she performs that task with the same totality she brought to everything else. She would have developed rituals, I think. The long vigils of any kind require rituals, small organising structures that give shape to formless time, that break the undifferentiated stretch of solitude into manageable units. The tending of the clock mechanism perhaps checking and adjusting, not because it needs constant attention, but because the act of attention is itself meaningful. The listening to the music box in the memorial room at whatever interval feels right. Not too often, because the tune is precious and too frequent use risks dulling its power, but often enough that the connection it carries remains alive. The practice of her fighting form, the careful daily maintenance of the technique that defines her, even though there is no one to fight and no one to witness. She has Gehrman's memory too, the teacher she loved, the man whose vision she carried out, and whose vision she has come to understand was never quite clean, was never quite honest, was always in service of a project that cared more about the acquisition of cosmic knowledge than about the cost paid by the people who stood between the church and what it wanted. Does she hate Gehrman? I don't think so. I think she loves him still. The way you can love someone clearly, seeing both what was beautiful in them and what was flawed, what was genuine and what was self-deceiving. She loved what he taught her. She may even love him, the man, with all his limitations and all his blind spots and the specific ways in which he chose not to look too carefully at what his project required. But she cannot pretend that his vision was innocent. She cannot pretend that following him was without moral cost. She cannot make the story of her training and her devotion into something clean by loving him hard enough. This is one of the quietest and most grown-up forms of grief. Loving something clearly, seeing it whole, and not being able to make it simple. Meanwhile, the research hall below her continues its experiments. The scholars of the Healing Church, in their increasingly frantic attempts to replicate the cosmic insights available to those who have natural contact with the Great Ones, resort to more and more extreme methods. They surgically remove patients' eyes, reasoning with a kind of horrifying logic that if the eyes are the organ of vision, then altering or removing them might force the development of some inner sight that allows perception of the cosmic. They put foreign objects, things from the deep, from the arcane, into their patients' skulls. They document the results. The results are screaming madness. Patients with misshapen heads and hands permanently raised above them, reaching for a sky they cannot see. Patients transformed by the very procedures meant to grant them enlightenment into something barely recognizable as human. Maria, in the clock tower above, cannot help these people, cannot stop the experiments below. She is not the church. She is not in a position to dismantle the institution she served, even if she wanted to. She is one person with a sword and an immovable purpose. She stands, she waits, she keeps time in a place where time has stopped mattering, and eventually she makes one more choice. Let us descend from the clock tower for a moment and understand the space below it. Because the research hall is not just background scenery for Maria's story, it is a testament to exactly what she was protecting the world from, and exactly why the specific nature of her sacrifice matters. The research hall is part of the Byrgenwerth Connected Research Complex in the Hunter's Nightmare. Byrgenwerth, for those following along, was the original academy where Laurence and Gehrman and other scholars first began to systematically study the old blood, the Great Ones, and the possibilities of human transformation through contact with the arcane. It was the intellectual birthplace of everything that followed: the healing church, the hunters, the beast plague, the entire catastrophic trajectory that Bloodborne's world is following. The research hall represents a later, more desperate phase of this same project. The original optimism of Byrgenwerth has soured. The questions have become more urgent, the methods less careful, the ethical guardrails more thoroughly dismantled. This is what research looks like when the researchers have stopped asking, "Should we do this?" and are only asking, "How do we do this?" There's a particular kind of institutional momentum that develops when a project has gone on long enough, consumed enough resources, involved enough people's careers and reputations, a momentum that makes stopping feel more impossible than continuing, regardless of what continuing costs. The research hall is that momentum made physical, made architectural, the patients in the research hall, and they are patients. They came here seeking help, seeking the healing that the healing church promised, are in states of extraordinary suffering. Some have had their eyes removed and replaced with alien organs that grant them new forms of perception, but also new forms of torment. Some have heads that have swollen and transformed beyond recognition, their skulls restructured by whatever was put inside them. Some are still wandering the halls in a kind of ambulatory madness, reaching upward constantly with their hands as if trying to grab something visible only to them. Think about what that reaching means. They came here broken and desperate, sick, perhaps, or wounded, or simply poor enough that the church's promise of miraculous healing was the only option they had left. They put their trust in an institution. They submitted to procedures they didn't fully understand, overseen by people with authority and credentials and the confident manner of those who have never been asked to account for their methods. And what they received in exchange for that trust was this: a transformation so radical it erased who they were, an endless compulsion towards something they can almost but not quite see, a raised hand reaching forever toward a ceiling that offers nothing back. There are also nurses here. The research hall nurses who appear throughout the nightmare are figures of genuine tragedy. Women, they appear to be women from their silhouettes and their remnant uniforms, who've been transformed by prolonged contact with the research materials, who have lost their original forms and purposes, who are now simply part of the institution's horror. They attack the player not from malice, but from some compulsion planted in them by their transformation, a reflex where a decision used to be. They were caregivers once. The specific cruelty of what happened to them is that it took the people whose role was to tend to the suffering and made them part of the suffering. It took the institutional function that was supposed to be redemptive, the nurse, the healer, the one who soothes and tends, and consumed it. The research hall has no healers anymore, only the remnant shapes of healers moving through the corridors of a hospital that has forgotten what hospitals are for. What were the researchers looking for in all of this? They were looking for insight, specifically for what the game calls eyes on the inside, a metaphor for a form of consciousness that can perceive the cosmic, that can engage with the Great Ones directly, that can understand what Laurence had originally dreamed of, genuine communion with beings of vast intelligence. The secret they'd glimpsed through the old blood, through the Pthumerian dungeons, through the Fishing Hamlet. They wanted to crack it open fully. They wanted to understand what the universe was on its own terms without the distortions of ordinary human perception. The theory behind the eye experiments is almost elegant in a horrifying way. If the ordinary human eye is the organ of ordinary human perception, then perhaps perception itself is limited by its instrument. Perhaps there are things to see that require a different kind of eye. An inner eye, a third eye in the tradition of mystical frameworks, an organ of cosmic perception that the physical eye both hosts and limits. Remove the physical, force the development of the inner, grant the patient access to the cosmic reality that the Church's scholars have been circling around for decades without being able to fully enter. This reasoning is not entirely without internal logic. The problem is not the reasoning. The problem is that the reasoning was applied to unwilling or insufficiently informed subjects, that the patients did not consent to become experiments in the truest sense of the word, and that the researcher's genuine desire for cosmic insight was indistinguishable, in its effects, from simple cruelty. This is not entirely ignoble as an ambition. The desire to know, the desire to understand, the reaching towards something larger than oneself. These are genuinely human qualities, and in the right context they are beautiful. The scholars of the research hall were not, in the beginning, monsters. They were people who wanted to understand, who had spent years in pursuit of something they genuinely believed was worthwhile, who had sacrificed their own comfort and safety in the service of this project. By the time they were operating on unwilling patients, they had accumulated so much investment in the project, emotional, intellectual, institutional, that they had lost the ability to step back and ask the fundamental question. But the research hall shows you what these qualities look like without constraint, without ethics, without the willingness to say, this is worth knowing, but not at this cost. The researchers here paid every cost without thinking about what they were paying. They used their patients as instruments. They used the Fishing Hamlet villagers as instruments. They were so focused on the object of their desire that they lost all sense of the people standing between them and it. And now those people are screaming in the research hall, and the researchers are gone, transformed or fled or dead, consumed by the very processes they had set in motion. This is what always happens, eventually, when knowledge is pursued without accountability to the people affected by the pursuit. The process consumes its practitioners. The research hall is not just the monument to what the healing church did to its patients. It is the monument to what the project did to everyone involved. The researchers are as gone as their subjects in their own way. Maria, above them in the clock tower, is not unaware of this. She can hear it. The research hall is not silent. It is full of the sounds of people in pain, of mechanisms grinding, of the research hall's ongoing deterioration echoing through the architecture. She cannot unhear it. She's been hearing it for however long she has been in the clock tower, months, years, the nightmare's unmeasured time, and it has not gotten easier. The screaming does not become background noise. Not for someone with her specific quality of attention, her specific refusal to pretend that what is happening isn't happening. She hears it every day, or what passes for days in the timeless nightmare, every vigil. She hears the consequence of the project she was part of, the institutional machine she served, still grinding on below her, and she stands in the tower above it, because what else can she do? She cannot heal them. She cannot shut it down. She can only be present with what was done, and ensure that the threshold she guards is not added to the catalogue of harms. There is one more thing about the research hall that matters enormously to Maria's story: the music box. In a room on the way to the clock tower, In an area that has the quality of a private memorial, there is a music box. When the player activates it, it plays melody, the same melody played by the music box in the hunter's dream, the same melody associated with Gehrman, with Maria, with the original core of the hunters before everything became complicated. This detail is heartbreaking in a way that doesn't require elaborate analysis. The music box is here because Maria put it here, or because it was here for her. The tune is Gehrman's. She kept it. Even here, even in exile, even in the aftermath of everything. She kept this small music artifact that connects her to the teacher she loved, and the time when things were simpler and the purpose was clearer. This room, the music box room, has a quality that is distinct from the rest of the research hall and the approaches to the clock tower. The rest of those spaces are institutional, functional in a horrible, broken way. But this room feels inhabited in the human sense. There are details here that suggest a person rather than a function. The placement of objects, the specific choice of what to keep. The music box itself, which has no practical purpose whatsoever in the context of the nightmare. It does not help her guard the threshold. It does not ward off the hunters who occasionally find their way here. It simply plays its tune when someone thinks to wind it. It is the thing she kept because she couldn't not keep it. The object that carries the emotional weight of something she can no longer access directly. Gehrman, the workshop, the years of training, the version of herself that existed before the Hamlet. She cannot go back to that. She knows she cannot go back to that. The music box does not pretend she can, but it holds the tune. It holds the memory of the tune. And sometimes, in the long, dark watches of the nightmare's endless night, the tune is what you have. She's not just a guardian. She's not just a sentinel. She's someone who misses what was. Someone who loved something that turned out to be complicated and has not been able to stop loving it even while understanding its complications. Someone who keeps a music box in a room she is probably the only person to visit and listens to it sometimes alone in the long watches of a timeless night. I find this unbearable in the most beautiful way. Eventually, Lady Maria died. She killed herself. Let me say that plainly, and then let's spend some time with it, because it deserves that time. This is not a moment to rush past, not a detail to note and move on from. It is the most private and most consequential act of her entire existence, and it belongs to her completely. No institution, no mission, no one else's agenda. For someone whose life had been so thoroughly shaped by external structures, Cainhurst's training, Gehrman's vision, the Healing Church's project, this final act is entirely and only hers. Maria took her own life in the clock tower. She sits when the player finds her, or rather, the player triggers her resurrection when they need her blood to advance. In a large chair at the top of the tower, in an attitude that can be read as sleep or as death, or as both at once. Her rakuyo is with her, her red coat, her pale hands folded in her lap. There is in her posture something that is neither peaceful nor anguished, something more considered than either of those, something like the posture of a person who has thought long and carefully about what they are doing and has decided that this is correct. She chose this. It was not an accident. It was not the consequence of battle or illness, or being consumed by the cosmic forces around her. She chose, at some point, to end her own life. Why? This is not a question the game answers directly, but the implications of the lore make a case, and it's a case worth listening to carefully, because it is not simple. Lady Maria was not a simple person, and her death is not a simple event. Partly it is almost certainly guilt. The specific guilt of the fishing hamlet carried for so long, growing no lighter with time. She could not undo what happened. She could not heal the people she had helped destroy. She could not make amends in any meaningful sense. She could stand guard. She did stand guard, but standing guard doesn't change what happened. It is forward-facing action in response to a backward-facing harm. It doesn't balance the scales. It never balances the scales. Some harms are not the kind that can be balanced. Some things done cannot be answered by any subsequent thing, no matter how sustained or sincere the effort. Maria, who'd been standing guard for what may have been years, understood this. The vigil had not diminished the weight. It had remained exactly as heavy as it always was, because weight is not the kind of thing that diminishes through bearing. It simply stays. Partly, it is isolation. She's been alone in this tower for a very long time, with the music box and the screaming patients below, and the perfect clock mechanism and the thing sealed beneath, and no one to speak to, no one to know her, no one who remembers who she was before the hamlet. Lady Maria who trained under Gehrman, Lady Maria of Cainhurst, Lady Maria who was exceptional and who had a specific way of holding a sword and specific things she believed in. All of that is just memory now, with no one to hold it alongside her. There is a particular quality to isolation that comes not from being alone in a crowd, or alone by circumstance, but alone by choice, or by the logic of a choice you made long ago, whose consequences have extended further than you anticipated. Maria's isolation in the clock tower was not forced on her entirely. She could have sought out contact perhaps if she had tried hard enough. She could have been less committed to the vigil, less rigorous about maintaining the separation between the threshold she guarded and the world above it. But she didn't. She stayed. And staying over the long unmeasured time of the nightmare had stripped away every context that might have made her existence feel connected to something beyond the clock tower walls. Partly, it may be something more radical than either guilt or isolation, a principled withdrawal. This is the reading I find most compelling, though it is the hardest to articulate. Maria is not someone who does things for simple reasons. Her death, like her life, was considered. She was, by the time of her death, trapped in the hunter's nightmare, a dimension created specifically to contain and preserve the hunters who participated in the Fishing Hamlet massacre. She may have understood with great clarity that she was there precisely because of what she did, that the nightmare was not simply a place she happened to be, but a consequence she was living out, that her presence in the nightmare was itself a form of justice, not justice administered by any authority she recognized, but the cosmic justice of a world where actions have consequences, where harm leaves a mark not only on the harmed, but on the one who causes the harm. In that context, her death takes on a different quality. It is not escape. The hunter's nightmare is specifically designed to prevent escape, to trap the consciousness of guilty hunters in an eternal loop of the hunt they sinned in. Her death in the nightmare doesn't release her from it. She remains there, because that is what the nightmare is for. So perhaps her death was not about escape at all. Perhaps it was about the only form of control available to her, in a situation where control had been almost entirely stripped away. She could not leave. She could not undo what she'd done. She could not be absolved by any authority she recognized or respected. But she could choose to stop. She could choose to no longer be in motion, no longer be actively present as an agent in a world that she felt she had polluted by her presence. She could become still. become the monument rather than the living person, become the past rather than the ongoing present. There is, in this, a strange kind of dignity, not the dignity of triumph or of redemption, but the dignity of someone who insists on exercising the last choice available to them with full deliberateness. She could not control what she had done, she could not control where she was, but she could control this. The manner and fact of her becoming still. She became still. She became a guardian who was herself a kind of monument. Not living, but not gone either. Present in the way that the past is present, there if you look for it, carrying its own weight of memory and meaning, but no longer making new choices or causing new harm. This is how she wanted to exist in the nightmare, maybe, not as a participant but as a fact that the cosmos had recorded and that would not be changed, but also not a fact that was going to add any further entries to the ledger. There's also one more element to consider. Maria sought to be rid of her rakuyo before she died. She tried to throw it away, to get rid of it, specifically because her rakuyo, her weapon, the thing she'd fashioned in homage to Gehrman's blade, had been used in the Fishing Hamlet, had participated in the massacre, her own hands, her own weapon, her own specific, skilled, trained violence, doing the precise work it had been trained to do, in the service of a purpose she could not forgive. She couldn't make herself hold it anymore. She tried to discard it. But the rakuyo, like many things in Bloodborne that have been part of significant events, didn't simply cease to exist when its bearer wanted it to. It remains. It is found by the player. The weapon that was present for the killing of the innocent continues to exist in the world, continues to be a weapon, because objects do not carry guilt in the way that people do. Objects simply persist. They don't have to live with what they've done. They don't have to stand guard over the threshold of what they were used for. They simply are in the world, available to whoever finds them. She couldn't destroy the evidence of what she'd done. She could only turn away from it. And perhaps that is the cleanest possible summary of Lady Maria's entire post-Hamlet existence. She could not undo it, could not destroy the evidence of it, could not be absolved of it. She could only turn away, keep turning, keep facing in the direction that involved the least direct confrontation with the specific image of what her hands had done, while simultaneously remaining utterly unable to stop facing it. I want to sit here for a moment, not rush past this, because Lady Maria's death is not a melodramatic gesture, and it is not a surrender. It is the terminal point of a life that had been, for a very long time, defined by its relationship to that one event, by the Fishing Hamlet, by what she'd been part of. She lived with it as long as she lived. She stood guard as long as she stood guard. She kept the music box as long as she kept the music box, and listened to the tune in the empty room, alone, measuring out the nightmare's time with the only instrument of precision available to her. And then she was done. There is something in this that is deeply, intimately familiar to anyone who has ever been very tired. Not the extreme action itself, I'm not speaking of that specifically, but the quality of exhaustion behind it, the exhaustion of the long-distance runner, the person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally arrived at the place, wherever that place is, however that place manifests, where the carrying can stop. She put it down. Let your breathing be slow. Let the room be quiet around you. Maria is in the clock tower, in the chair, still. The clock above her continues to tick. Perfect. Unhurried. Measuring time that she no longer has to live through minute by minute. There is a certain beauty, if you can call it that, in the image of her there. The red coat, the pale hands, the rakuyo nearby, the weapon she tried to discard and couldn't. Present with her at the end the way the things we try hardest to put down are sometimes most stubbornly present. The chair at the top of the tower beneath the clock, with the whole architecture of consequence surrounding her and the music box somewhere below, and the key at the bottom of the well and the patience in the research hall, and the seal on the door holding the threshold closed. Everything she was, and everything she did, and everything she spent her remaining existence guarding against. All of it present, in that room, around that chair, and her, finally still in the middle of it, the eye of the storm, the fixed point in a world that had lost its bearings. This is how she chose to exist at the end, not running, not pretending, not constructing a comfortable story about what she'd done or who she'd been, simply present with it completely until she was done being present, and then still. Now let's talk about the Hunter's Nightmare, because this is the dimension where you encounter Lady Maria in the game, and understanding what the nightmare is changes everything about the nature of her existence there. The nightmare is not simply a setting, it is a sentence, an architectural consequence, a space that was called into being specifically because of what was done, and that has been sustained since its creation by the ongoing fact of what was done remaining unresolved. The Hunter's Nightmare was created, or called into being, or condensed from guilt and consequence, because of the Fishing Hamlet. More specifically, because of the hunters who participated in the Fishing Hamlet massacre. The Great One connected to that place, the entity the villagers had honoured for so long, in the water, with their patient and humble devotion, exacted a price for the violation visited upon its people. Not a simple revenge, not a destruction, something more specific and more terrible, an eternal hunt. Consider the elegance of this punishment, in the most unsettling possible sense of the word elegant. The Great Ones are entities of cosmic scale, of intelligence so vast that their motives and methods are, as we've established, only partially comprehensible to human minds. But in the design of the nightmare, there is something that reads unmistakably as understanding. Understanding of specifically what a hunter is, what a hunter values, what would constitute the worst possible consequence for a person who has given their entire self to the hunt. The hunt is what hunters are. It is not what they do, it is what they are. Take everything else away, their name, their history, their relationships, the morning after a long night, and what remains is the hunt, the fog, the beasts, the necessity of continuing forward, and the nightmare gives them this in its purest, most stripped down form forever. The hunt without morning, without purpose, without the possibility of completion, without the faces of the people they thought they were protecting. Just the hunt itself, naked and endless, stripped of every justification and every meaning, with only the hunter's own conscience for company. The nightmare is a hunt that never ends. It is the Yharnam night of the hunt, recreated in a dimension outside ordinary time, and it does not progress toward morning. There is no morning in the nightmare. The beasts are always there. The fog is always present. The streets are always running with violence and fire, and the hunters condemned to it hunt forever, unable to stop, unable to progress, unable to die in any final sense, just cycling through the same endlessly repeating horror. The nightmare is not empty. It contains echoes and residues of the real Yharnam, buildings, streets, the research hall, the clock tower, all of it present in the nightmare in forms that are recognizable but wrong. like a dream version of the original with the logic slightly different, the proportions slightly off, the purpose of each space uncertain in ways the waking versions were not. You know this building, you have seen this street, but something in the angles is different, something in the light. The nightmare is Gehrman, as Gehrman remembers itself when it is trying to forget something. Ludwig the Accursed is here. Ludwig, who was one of the great church hunters after Gehrman, the first of what the church called League hunters, the person who transformed the hunt from a small specialist practice into something with genuine scale and institutional presence. He introduced horses, he organised groups, he trained recruits in the hundreds rather than the dozens. He made the hunt efficient, and in making it efficient he made it more powerful, and in making it more powerful he made it capable of things that a smaller, less organised hunt could not have done, including the Fishing Hamlet. Now he is in the nightmare's sewers, a massive four-legged horror, barely recognisable as a human being, still somehow clutching the holy moonlight sword, that beautiful glowing blade that seems to carry within it whatever light Ludwig was before the transformation consumed him. And in the moment after his defeat, when the player stands over him and he has lost his beast form and is simply Ludwig again, briefly dying, he asks about the sword. He asks if it is beautiful. He is, for that moment, the man he was before everything, the idealist, the visionary, the person who thought the hunt was a righteous cause and threw himself into it with the kind of commitment that doesn't leave room for doubt. His horror is specifically a hunter's horror. He has become what he hunted. He has been so thoroughly transformed by the beast plague after so many years in the nightmare that he is barely recognisable, but barely is not completely. He still has his sword, he still fights like a hunter in his second phase, upright, controlled, purposeful in a way that the first phase beast was not. The training survives the transformation, the muscle memory survives, the body, even having become something unrecognisable, still moves in the patterns it learned in Gehrman's workshop. This is one of the nightmare's cruelest details. You cannot simply become the beast and lose yourself in it. The self persists. The hunter persists inside the beast. Ludwig still knows he was Ludwig. He still asks about the sword's beauty. He still has inside him the memory of the purpose he believed in. And the beast form that has grown up around that memory is the consequence of that purpose. All those years of hunting, all that accumulated violence in the name of protection, manifesting finally as the thing the protection was supposed to be against. And Maria is here, in the clock tower, guarding the thing beneath it as she guarded it in life. But where Ludwig has been consumed, Maria has remained herself. This difference between them is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not accidental. What keeps Maria intact here, when Ludwig has been so thoroughly transformed? Why has the nightmare not simply done to her what it has done to everyone else? Several possible answers. First, Maria's relationship to her guilt is clear-eyed rather than suppressed. Ludwig in life may have been the kind of person who found ways to not look too directly at what the hunt required, who maintained his idealism by looking at the big picture rather than the specific acts. The nightmare, which forces confrontation with exactly what you did, is thus maximally disruptive to him. His sense of himself depended on a certain selective vision that the nightmare destroys. Maria, by contrast, never looked away. She saw the Hamlet clearly. She knew exactly what she had done. The nightmare cannot show her anything she hasn't already shown herself. Second, her vigil gives her an anchor. She has a purpose in the nightmare. Not a purpose given to her by the nightmare itself, but a purpose she brought with her and has maintained against the nightmare's entropy. The vigil is hers. It is continuous with who she was before she entered the nightmare. It gives her something to be that is not simply the person who did the Fishing Hamlet. It is the person who did the Fishing Hamlet and is spending her eternal existence in consequence of that, standing guard at the threshold she helped create. This is still herself here, still principled, still precise, still bearing the weight of what she carries without being broken by it, still guarding. And this speaks to something important about the nature of the hunter's nightmare as a punishment. It doesn't simply destroy the guilty, it preserves them in a form that keeps them present with their guilt. Ludwig is still, somewhere inside, Ludwig, and that somewhere is where the horror lives. Maria is still Maria, and Maria is someone who knows exactly what she did and why it was wrong, and has chosen to remain present with that knowledge rather than seek relief from it. The nightmare keeps you present with yourself. That's its specific quality. You cannot escape into mindlessness. You cannot become the beast so thoroughly that the person you were stops watching. You're always there, watching, knowing, unable to change what you know. For Maria, this means an eternal vigil, an eternal standing guard over the evidence of the wrong she participated in. The clock tower's clock ticking out an endless night that never tips into morning. The screaming from the research hall drifting up through the architecture in a continuous reminder of the project she served. And the music box in the memorial room playing its tune when no one is there to wind it, because in the nightmare, some things simply persist past the point where they should have stopped. The music box plays its tune, the clock ticks, the patients below scream their endless screams, and Maria waits. For what? For someone to come. For the story to reach its end. For the player who will eventually arrive, not as an agent of the healing church, not as a scholar seeking to extract knowledge, but as someone following the logic of the nightmare to its source, trying to understand and perhaps finally undo the cycle of consequence that the Fishing Hamlet set in motion. She waits for someone worth letting through. When the player finally reaches Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower, they trigger her resurrection, her return to a state of animation, of combat readiness, through accessing the thing she's been guarding. In the game's narrative logic, the player needs Maria's blood to construct a device that allows access to the deeper secret beneath the clock tower. To get her blood, they must defeat her. This framing is worth pausing on before the fight itself begins. The player needs her blood. In a game entirely structured around the significance of blood, the old blood, the healing blood, the corrupt blood, the blood of the great ones, this is not a neutral request. Blood in Bloodborne is never simply a biological fluid. It is identity. It is lineage. It is the carrier of everything that makes a person who they are, in both the ordinary and the cosmic sense. To take someone's blood is to take something essential from them, something that carries their whole history. Maria's blood carries the history of Cainhurst, of Gehrman's training, of the Fishing Hamlet, of the long vigil. It is not simply a key, it is everything she is, distilled. She wakes, she rises, she takes her rakuyo from its resting place, and she is absolutely present in the waking, not disoriented, not fragile, not confused. She is a hunter. Hunters wake ready. The fight that follows is one of the most beautiful and most emotionally complex in all of Bloodborne, which is saying something, because Bloodborne's boss encounters are consistently extraordinary pieces of game design. Every boss in Bloodborne is a story as well as a fight, a compressed physical narrative that tells you something about who this person was and what they represent. The cleric beast is the first transformation, the template for what the plague does. Father Gascoigne is the cost of the hunt on a person who loved something outside of it. Each fight is a statement about the world and about what the world costs. Maria's fight has 3 phases, and these phases are not just escalations of difficulty. They are stages of revelation, a complete character arc delivered through combat in roughly 10 minutes that encompasses everything we've spent this whole long evening discussing. In the first phase, she fights you the way you'd expect Lady Maria of Cainhurst to fight. Clean, precise, efficient. No excess, no waste. Every movement purposeful, every strike placed with the economy of someone who's been training since childhood and has never stopped. Her rakuyo moves in the patterns that the best hunters develop over years of practice. The elegant geometries of someone who has integrated their weapon so thoroughly that using it is like breathing. She's reserved here, professional. There is no anger in her technique, no desperation. If there is emotion behind the precision, she has it completely in hand. This is Lady Maria as she presented herself to the world, as she wanted to be seen, and as she genuinely was, in the best of herself. The huntress, the professional. Every strike in this first phase is a statement. I was excellent. Whatever else I was this. I gave my life to this and I gave it well. But in the second phase, she cuts open her palm and sets her own hand on fire. This is one of the most striking images in the game. She is wounded by the player, and her response is to wound herself further, to add to the injury, to take what is already hurting and make it burn. She uses her own blood as fuel. The harm to her enemy and the harm to herself become the same gesture, the same action, the same fire. This is the guilt phase. This is the Maria who stood guard for years, hearing the screaming from below, listening to the music box in the memorial room, finding that neither the vigil nor the music made the weight any lighter. This is what that weight looks like in motion rather than in stillness. It burns. It turns inward. The capacity for harm that she couldn't stop herself from having becomes harm directed at herself, and somehow that feels more honest than the contained precision of the first phase. There is something in this second phase that players often find harder to watch than to fight, because the self-inflicted fire is so legible. You don't need to know the Fishing Hamlet lore to understand it in your body. It means, I am already burning. It means the outside harm is less than the inside one. The third phase, she adds blood to the fire, and the fire becomes something else. Arcane, vast, oceanic. Her fighting style shifts. The attacks grow wider and stranger, less predictable, with sweeping arcs that suggest the pull of something larger than her own intention. She moves through the room differently now, with less of the controlled geometry of the first phase, and more of something that reaches beyond her individual personhood, toward the Fishing Hamlet, toward the Great One in the water, toward the whole enormous, terrible context that she was merely one person inside of. She is, in this third phase, the embodiment of everything. Cainhurst's training and Gehrman's teaching and the Fishing Hamlet and the long vigil and the music box and the key in the well, all at once, all in motion. She is the consequence and the cause and the person caught between them. She is the hunter who was also the harm, and the guardian who was also the culprit, and the principled woman who never once pretended her principles made her innocent. When she falls, When the player stands over her and the fight is finished, she says very little. She doesn't monologue, she doesn't explain or justify or ask to be understood. She says, "Let me forget everything." 4 words, the entirety of her defeat. Not, "I am sorry." Not, "It was complicated." Not, "the best available option in a bad situation." None of the softening language that people use when they want to reduce the weight of what they've done. Just let me forget. Let me be done with the weight of knowing. Let me put down, finally, the specific, terrible clarity of understanding exactly what I did and exactly why it was wrong. This is the most human moment in the game. Perhaps the most human moment in any game I have encountered, because it does not ask for anything that requires another person to grant. It does not ask the player for forgiveness. It does not ask the universe for absolution. It asks only to be relieved of the burden of consciousness, of the self that knows. She asks to forget, and in the nightmare, perhaps finally after everything she can. The player takes her blood, the story moves forward, and Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower is, at last, still. But she's not really gone, is she? She's never really gone. That's the thing about characters like this. They exist in the space between the text and the reader, or in this case, between the game and the player, and in that space they continue to live and breathe and be interpreted long after the specific narrative encounter has ended. Lady Maria has become, in the years since Bloodborne's release, one of the most beloved and most analysed characters in contemporary gaming. Not because she has the most screen time, she doesn't, not by a significant margin. Not because she delivers memorable speeches or anchors a complex political subplot, but because of something rarer and harder to manufacture, because she feels real in the most important sense, because players meet her and feel, with immediate conviction, that they have encountered a person rather than a character, a person who has a history, who made choices, who carries consequences, whose interiority, even when hidden behind silence and violence and the locked room quality of the clock tower, is unmistakably present. Let's talk about some of the most interesting interpretations and theories that have accumulated around her, because part of the joy of a world as rich as Bloodborne is the conversation it generates, the ongoing community engagement with its mysteries and implications. One of the most discussed elements of Lady Maria's lore is her relationship to Gehrman. Specifically, there are clear indications in the game that Gehrman's feelings for Maria went beyond those of a teacher for a student, and that these feelings were, at minimum, complicated and possibly unrequited. The doll in the hunter's dream, the gentle, helpful figure who allows the player to level up, is modelled on Lady Maria. Gehrman made the doll in Maria's image. This is a fact of the game's lore that is presented without extensive commentary, but it speaks volumes. He built a companion for himself, for the endless vigil of the hunter's dream, and he built it in the image of someone specific, someone he had lost. Is the doll a love letter? A memorial? A way of keeping someone present who he could no longer be with? The fan community has discussed all of these readings at length, and I don't think there's one clean answer. What I think is clear is that Maria's loss was, for Gehrman, specifically significant. Not just the loss of a student or a colleague, but the loss of someone who mattered to him in ways he couldn't easily articulate or replace. There's a painful irony here. Gehrman created the doll in Maria's image as a kind of comfort or memorial, but the doll is serenely, gently happy in a way that Maria never was. The doll has none of Maria's weight, none of her guilt, none of the terrible specific gravity of someone who has done something they cannot forgive themselves for. The doll is Maria cleaned of everything that made Maria Maria, which may be exactly what Gehrman needed, the beloved without the pain, and which is also exactly why it doesn't work. You can't truly replace a person with the idealized version of them. The thing you loved was also the weight and the silence and the specific suffering. What does Maria think of the doll? We don't know. She may not know the doll exists. Depending on how you interpret the chronology and the relationship between the nightmare and the dream. But I like to imagine her, briefly, knowing. I like to imagine her understanding what Gehrman had done and feeling in it something complicated. Not anger, not flattery, but perhaps recognition. The recognition that she had mattered to him in a way that outlasted her ability to receive that mattering. That she had been loved in the specific and insufficient way that humans love each other, inadequately, across gaps that the love itself couldn't bridge, but genuinely. Bloodborne is, at its deepest level, a story about cosmic horror, about the encounter with entities and realities that are so far beyond human scale and human comprehension that the encounter itself is transformative and destabilizing. The Great Ones, the cosmos, the infinite dark. These are the true subject matter of the game, and every character is, in some way, a lens through which we look at these themes. Lady Maria's specific relationship to the cosmic horror is unique among Bloodborne's major characters. Most characters either seek the cosmic, they want the insight, they want the communion, they want to elevate themselves to the Great One's level, or they are consumed by it involuntarily, becoming beasts or madmen as a side effect of the old blood. Maria did neither. Maria was proximate to the cosmic. She was present at the fishing hamlet in the company of the entity in the water, but she did not pursue it for herself. She was, in the context of the cosmic horror, simply a person in the wrong place at the wrong time, serving the wrong institution. Her tragedy is not the tragedy of Icarus flying too close to the sun. It is the tragedy of the person who held the ladder for the person flying too close to the sun and is now standing at the bottom with burned hands looking at the feathers. This is a less common form of cosmic horror tragedy, and in some ways a more insidious one. You don't need to reach for the terrible thing to be implicated by it. You just need to be in its orbit, in service of people who are reaching. The Fishing Hamlet massacre was a cosmic horror event in the sociological sense. The powerful consuming the vulnerable in the service of transcendence. The transcendent seeking is the cosmic element. The consumption is the horror, and Maria is caught in the middle, neither seeking transcendence nor immune to responsibility for the horror. Her guilt, in this light, is a form of moral perception that the other characters largely lack. Laurence is dead, and possibly ascended and certainly beyond ordinary guilt. Gehrman is trapped in his own nightmare, his own contract with the moon presence, his own form of endless expiation. The healing church is an institution, and institutions don't feel guilt, but Maria feels it. Maria specifically, exactly, clearly feels what was done. And that clarity is itself a kind of extraordinary thing. In a world of people who have blinded themselves with ideology or transformed themselves into something post-human, she maintains the painful, ordinary capacity to know that something wrong happened and to be accountable to that knowing. I want to spend a moment on something that a number of scholars and critics of Bloodborne have noted. The specific texture of Lady Maria's story as a story about a woman in a patriarchal institution. She is surrounded by men who hold power: Laurence, Gehrman, Willem, the scholars of Bürgenwerth, all men. She is extraordinarily capable, more capable, arguably, than any of them in the specific skills that the institution most values. She is trusted, respected, admired, but she is not the one who sets the agenda. She is not the one who decides what the expedition to the fishing hamlet is for. She is not the one who decides that the villagers' resistance is an acceptable cost. She executes decisions made by others with excellence, and then lives with the consequences that those others largely do not have to live with. This is a pattern that has a very human, very recognizable shape. The person who is skilled and principled and committed, who gives their best to an institution, and who discovers that the institution has been using their best in service of things they would not have endorsed if they'd been consulted. The person who is trusted enough to be sent to do the difficult work but not consulted enough to be asked whether the work should be done. And then she is the one who carries the guilt. Not Laurence, who conceived the project. Not whoever ordered the specific escalation at the hamlet. Not the church hierarchy that benefited from the knowledge extracted. Maria, who was there, who used her own hands, who cannot dissociate herself from the act because she was physically present for it. Whether this was an intentional thematic choice by the designers, I can't say with certainty. But the shape of the story is there, and it resonates with a kind of specificity that feels too precise to be accidental. Let's return to one of the central mysteries. What exactly is beneath the clock tower that Maria is guarding? The answer has to do with something called the nightmare and the dream, the layers of reality that exist above and below ordinary waking experience in Bloodborne's cosmology. The entity associated with the fishing hamlet, the great one in the water, is connected to something called the nightmare of Mensis, or more broadly to the nightmare layer of reality that the most deeply affected characters inhabit. The villagers' remains, their transformed bodies, the residue of their long contact with the Great One. These are kept in a space beneath the clock tower that is essentially a threshold, a point where the nightmare reality and the physical reality touch and can be crossed from one to the other. Maria is guarding this threshold. She's keeping the two realities from interfering with each other in ways that would be catastrophic. She's ensuring that the access point exists, because it has to exist, because the nature of the cosmos doesn't allow for simply sealed off regions, but that it is not used carelessly or exploitatively. This is, in a sense, a redemptive function. She is using the access created by the harm that was done as the foundation for a guardian role that prevents further harm. She cannot undo the opening, but she can stand at the opening and decide who comes through and when. It's not enough. It's never enough, but it is something. It is what she has. The player, when they arrive, is not seeking to exploit the threshold for the church's purposes. They are seeking to understand, to follow the story to its end, to reach the source of the nightmare, to potentially break the cycle. In this specific case, Maria's guardianship is not in conflict with the player's purpose, and so she lets them through, not willingly exactly, not without the battle that tests them and that expresses everything she carries. But ultimately she does let them through. This is her last act of trust, her last act of judgment. She does not mistake the player for an agent of the healing church. She fights them, yes, because she fights everyone who comes here, because that is the form her guardianship takes. But she falls, and in falling she opens the way, Let me forget everything. We've come a long way tonight. Think about how far we've travelled. We began with the Pthumerians, those ancient keepers of the deep, who discovered the old blood in the lightless caverns beneath their civilization and built an entire world around it, until that world consumed them. We watched Laurence dream his beautiful, doomed dream of healing and transcendence, and we watched the healing church grow from that dream into something enormous and cold and willing to do terrible things in the name of what it believed. We found the Fishing Hamlet. We spent time with those quiet people, those keepers of the coastal secret who maintained their patient relationship with the thing in the water with a dignity and simplicity that the sophisticated scholars of the church entirely lacked. We saw what was done to them, slowly, without flinching. We found Maria, young, exceptional, principled, proud, a Cainhurst noble who became Gehrman's best student, who fashioned a weapon in homage to her teacher's blade and gave herself to the hunt with the totality of the genuinely devoted. We watched her go to the hamlet. We watched her understand what she'd been part of. We followed her to the clock tower. We watched her throw the key into the well. We watched her stand guard for an unmeasurable amount of time, alone with the music box and the perfect clock and the screaming below. We watched her die. We found her in the nightmare, still there, still herself, still standing between the threshold and those who would misuse it. And we fought her in 3 phases that were 3 revelations: the huntress, the penitent, the embodiment of cosmic grief. We heard her last words, "Let me forget everything." Now I want to ask you something, as you lie in your dark room with the story wrapped around you. What do you think of her? Not what the game's lore formally tells you to think. Not whether she was good or evil, justified or unjustified. Just, what do you feel, having spent this time with her, having followed her from the beginning to the end? I feel grief when I think about Lady Maria. The specific grief you feel for someone who was genuinely trying to be good, who gave their genuine best, and who was used, who was in the right place with the right intentions and the wrong institution at the wrong time, who never stopped being accountable even when no one else was, who stood guard when she could have simply been done with it. I feel something like admiration too, not uncritical admiration. She did terrible things, and her standing guard later does not erase the Fishing Hamlet. But she didn't pretend it wasn't terrible. She didn't construct a self-serving narrative about necessity or greater goods. She knew what it was. She stood next to that knowing for her entire remaining existence, without looking away. That's unusual. That's harder than it sounds. And I feel tenderness for the music box, the small, private, entirely unnecessary detail of the music box, because that is where the person lives in a story like this, not in the grand gestures, not in the battles and the guardianship and the cosmic significance, in the small thing you kept because you couldn't throw it away. The tune you listen to alone in the long watches of an endless night, because it connected you to something warm and before and not yet ruined. We all have music boxes, I think. We all have the small thing that connects us to the time before the complicated things happened. The thing we keep, even when we can't explain why, even when the keeping of it is just another form of the grief. Tonight, let your music box play softly, whatever that is for you, whatever the equivalent of that tune in your own life, the song, the memory, the image of something warm and specific and yours. Let it play quietly in the back of your mind as you settle into sleep. You don't have to do anything with it. You don't have to resolve it or integrate it or perform any kind of meaningful emotional work. Just let it be there. Let it accompany you into sleep, the way any good tune should, softly, without demanding anything, just present. And while it plays, let the world of Bloodborne recede gently behind you, not forgotten. You know it now, fully, in a way you perhaps didn't before tonight, but no longer urgent, no longer demanding to be examined and understood, just there, behind you, in the way that any rich and fully inhabited world is there behind you when you close the book. Present as a quality in the air, a weight that is actually a kind of comfort, because richness has weight, and stories that mean something have a particular gravity that you can feel even with your eyes closed. Lady Maria is in her tower. Gehrman is in his workshop in the dream, tending his garden, an old man who made his peace with a complicated life in a complicated world as best he could. The fishing hamlet is quiet on the shore of the cold grey sea, quieter than it has any right to be perhaps, given what happened there, but quiet nonetheless. The clock is ticking in the tower above it all, measuring time in a place where time has lost its meaning, insisting on the second and the minute and the hour even in the dark. And you are here, not there, here in your room, in the specific and irreplaceable reality of your own life, your own warmth, your own breath, your own history, your own particular way of moving through the world. You're not in the nightmare. You're not standing guard over anything tonight. You have put down whatever you were carrying today, or you're putting it down now, gently, one piece at a time, like unpacking a bag at the end of a long trip. There is nothing you need to figure out before you sleep. There is no threshold you need to guard tonight. The clock is keeping time without your help. The tune is playing without anyone winding it. Everything that needs to continue will continue on its own, without your conscious attention holding it in place. You are allowed to let go. The room is quiet now. The story is complete. Lady Maria of the Astral Clocktower, from the beginning to the end, from Pthumeru to the nightmare, from Gehrman's workshop to the well where she threw the key, from the fishing hamlet to the final words. Let me forget everything. You are warm. You are safe. The world outside is still and distant and not requiring anything of you tonight. Your body is heavy in the good way, the way it gets when you've been awake long enough, and the weight of waking has finally caught up with you. And rest is no longer an option to consider, but a fact that's happening. Your breath is slow. You don't have to count it or manage it. Just notice that it's happening. In, out. The reliable, patient rhythm of a body that knows how to do this without any help from your conscious mind. The clock tower clock is ticking somewhere, keeping perfect time in an imperfect world, measuring out the moments in their even, unhurried sequence, each moment exactly as long as the one before it, no moment rushed, no moment wasted. You've listened to a long story tonight. You have held a lot of history, a lot of feeling, a lot of the specific gravity of a person's life and what it cost her and what she gave in return. And now it's time to put that down. Let it go. It doesn't need to be carried through the night. It will be here when you wake up, if you want it. But right now, just let it settle somewhere quiet in you, the way a story settles when you've finished reading. Present, complete, not requiring anything more. Let your eyes stay closed. Let your jaw stay loose. Let the space between your thoughts grow wider and wider, the way a river mouth grows wide before it meets the sea, until the thoughts themselves are just shapes in the distance, not demanding to be followed, not urgent, just there and then not there. You are at the edge of something, the edge between the waking world and the other one, the good edge, the edge you've been moving toward all night with every breath, with every slow exhale. Lady Maria is in her tower, Gehrman is in his workshop. The fishing hamlet is quiet on the shore of the cold grey sea. The clock is ticking, and you are right here, in your room, in your bed, in the dark, in the specific and irreplaceable reality of your own life, your own warmth, your own breath, your own particular way of existing in the world. It is enough. You are enough. Tonight, right now, in this moment, there is nothing missing. Sleep well, sleep gently. The hunt can wait until morning.